Post-colonial literature is the body of literary writings that respond to the intellectual discourses of European colonization in Asia, Africa, Middle East, the Pacific and elsewhere. Post-colonial literature addresses the problems and consequences of the decolonization of a country and of a nation, especially the political and cultural independence of formerly subjugated colonial peoples. It also covers literary critiques of and about post-colonial literature, the undertones of which carry, communicate, and justify racialism and colonialism. But most contemporary forms of post-colonial literature present literary and intellectual critiques of the post-colonial discourse by endeavoring to assimilate post-colonialism and its literary expressions. Critical approach: post-colonial literary criticism re-examines colonial literature, especially concentrating upon the social discourse, between the colonizer and the colonized, that shaped and produced the literature. In Orientalism, Edward Soddy analyzed the fiction of Honoré copyright de Balzac, Charles Baudelaire, and L'Autre copyright Armand, and explored how they were influenced, and how they helped to shape the societal fantasy of European racial superiority. Post-colonial fiction writers deal with the traditional colonial discourse either by modifying or by subverting it, or both. An exemplar post-colonial novel is Wide Sargasso Sea, by Jean Rhys, a predecessor story to Jane Eyre, by Charlotte Brontë, a literary variety wherein a familiar story is retold from the perspective of a subaltern protagonist, Antoinette Cosway, who, within the story and the plot, is a socially oppressed minor character who is renamed and variously exploited. As such, in post-colonial literature, the protagonist usually struggles with questions of identity, social identity, cultural identity, national identity, etc. Usually caused by experiencing the psychological conflicts inherent to cultural assimilation, to living between the old, native world and the dominant hegemony of the invasive social and cultural institutions of the colonial imperialism of a mother country. The anti-conquest narrative recasts the natives of colonized countries as victims rather than foes of the colonizers. This depicts the colonized people in a more human light but risks absolving colonizers of responsibility for addressing the impacts of colonization by assuming that native inhabitants were doomed to their fate. Notable authors by region: this section needs to be expanded with J. M. Kwesi, Maurice Condé copyright, Cyril Dubidine, Tsidang Garambga, Max Davina, Buchi Makita, Athol Fugard, Nadine Gordimer, Brayton Breitenbach, Andrew copyright Brink, Bonnie Hicks, Hanifka Riaishi, Doris Lessing, Earl Lovelace, Gabriel Garka Amaya Quez, Bharati Mukherjee, Barbara Kingsolver, versus Nepal, Michael Ondaj, Arcane Narayan, Mahashweta Devi, M. Forster, Anita Desai, Wilbur Smith, Will Soyinka, Gar copyright Wathiogo, Yvonne Vera, Derek Walcott, Kath Walker, Pear Mafaki, Arundhati Roy, Amitav Ghosh, Haim Sabato, Eleanor Dark, Bol Butake, Anton Itang, Bate B. Song, Maxine Hong Kingston. Marcus Garvey, France Fanon, Oima copyright Car copyright Sawaya, La copyright Ondamas, Jumpalairi. African La copyright Apold Senghor conceived the idea of Na copyright Gratitude, Homi K. Bhabha, Hampata copyright Barcent, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart made a significant mark in African literature. II Kwayama and 2000 Seasons tried to establish an African perspective to their own history. In Britain, J. G. Farrell's novels Troubles, The Siege of Krishnapur and The Singapore Grip, written during the 1970s, are important texts dealing with the collapse of the British Empire. Season of Migration to the North by Tabeslid. Daleen Mati, Phila's Child. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie continues this examination in the 21st century of the effects of British colonization, specifically on Nigeria in Half of a Yellow Sun and the resultant civil war. The Americas Isabel Allende from Chile contributes to Latin American literature and occasionally writes in a style called magical realism or vivid storytelling, also used by Gabriel Garca Amaya Quez, Juan Rulfo and Salman Rushdie. Poet and novelist Gianna Nabroy from Puerto Rico directly addresses the colonial situation of Puerto Rico and the United States of Banana. The author Jean Rhys made a significant contribution to post-colonial literature in her novel Wide Sargasso Sea, which describes a Creole woman whose British husband mistreats her based on his perceptions of her cultural heritage. The Canadian writer Margaret Atwood is also a post-colonial writer who dealt with themes of identity seeking through her Southern Ontario Gothic style of writing. The Middle East Negub Mahfouz novelist, Edward said eminent scholar on Orientalism, because of Said's work the term Orientalism becomes more and more negatively connotated. Especially, as it is dismantled as a series of misconceptions about the region commonly referred to as the Orient. The Orient is constructed as the inferior shadow to the civilized and powerful West, the Occident. Its supposed inferiority is always explained in racial terms. Asia Post-colonial writings have been found among much of Indian literature. Salman Rushdie has also contributed to the post-colonial literature. His second novel, Midnight's Children, won the Booker Prize in 1981. Philippine authors like F. Sunil Jose Copyright, Jose Dulce, Jr., N.V.M. Gonzalez and Nick Joaquin write about the post-colonial situation in the Philippines. Indian authors like Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, Anita Desai, Hanifka Riaishi, Rohinton Mistry, Miena Alexander, Arundhati Roy and Karan Desai have contributed to the category. Sri Lankan writers like Nehal de Silva or Carl Muller write about the post-colonial situation and the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, while Michael Ondarch, international the most acclaimed author with Sri Lankan roots, adds the perspective of the diaspora. Selim Al-Din from Bangladesh has also written post-colonial drama. Pema Fakir's novels Makan and Palito entirely and vividly engage the post-colonial drama unfolded in India and the subcontinent. Dutch India's literature includes Dutch-language post-colonial literature reflecting on the era of the Dutch East Indies. Much of the post-colonial literature of this genre is written by Dutch Eurasians known as Indos. Important authors that have been translated to English include J. Lee Robinson, Maria Dermout and Marion Blum. Though written by American author David Henry Wang, M. Butterfly is one post-colonial work regarding the Western perception of the East in general, but specifically addresses the Western perspective on China and the French and American perspectives on Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Pacific There is a burgeoning group of young Pacific writers who respond and speak to the contemporary Pacifica experience, including writers Lanny Went Young, Courtney Shiner Meredith and Selena Dusatala Mausch, among others. Reclamation of culture, loss of culture, diaspora, all themes common to post-colonial literature, are present within the collective Pacific writers. Pioneers within the literature include senior writers Whitty Imera and Albert Wendt, who are both credited as two of the most influential living Pacific authors. Another notable figure within the Pacific is Sayar Feigl, whose debut novel Where We Once Belonged won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize Best First Book of 1997, Southeast Asia and South Pacific region. Critics' point of view: what qualifies as post-colonial literature is debatable. The term post-colonial literature has taken on many meanings. The four subjects include social and cultural change or erosion. It seems that after independence is achieved, one main question arises. What is the new cultural identity? Misuse of power and exploitation. Even though the large power ceases to control them as a colony, the settlers still seem to continue imposing power over the native. The main question here is who really is in power, why, and how does an Independence Day really mean independence? Colonial abandonment and alienation. This topic is generally brought up to examine individuals and not the ex-colony as a whole. The individuals tend to ask themselves, in this new country, where do I fit in and how do I make a living? Use of English language literature. It may be asked if the target of post-colonial studies, that is the analysis of post-colonial literature and culture, can be reached neglecting literary works in the original languages of post-colonial nations. Post-colonial literary critics. Edward Said is often considered to have been the seminal post-colonial critic. Other useful critics are Bill Ashcroft, Nga Copyright Wathiogo, Homi K. Bhabha, Frantz Fanon, Chinua Achebe, Leela Gandhi, Gareth Griffiths, Abiola E. Real, John MacLeod, Gayatri Spivak, Hamid Darbashi, Helen Tiffin, Carl Torabulli, and Robert Young. See also, Colonialism, Colonial Cinema, Tsar Publications, Indian English Literature, Francophone Literature, Hungarianism, Vernacular Literature, Migrant Literature, Penguin Book of Modern African Poetry, Post-colonial Theory and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. References. Sources: Hart, Jonathan. Goldie, Terry. Post-colonial Theory. In Makarike, Irene Rima. Hutchin, Linda. Perrin, Paul. Encyclopedia of Contemporary Literary Theory, Approaches, Scholars, Terms. Toronto, Canada, University of Toronto Press. ISBN 0-8020-5914-7. Retrieved November 14, 2011. Further reading, Tobias Dar Paragraph Ring, Post-colonial Literatures in English, An Introduction, 2008. Prem Podder and David Johnson, A Historical Companion to Post-colonial Literature in English, 2005. Alamgir Hashmi, The Commonwealth, Comparative Literature and the World, 1988. John Thiam, The Arnold Anthology of Post-colonial Literatures in English, Chelsea 46, World Literature in English, Poetry International 7/8, Eugene Benson and L.W. Connolly, Encyclopedia of Post-colonial Literatures in English, 1994, 2005. John MacLeod, Beginning Post-colonialism, 2nd edition. Alamgir Hashmi, Commonwealth Literature, An Essay Towards the Redefinition of a Popular Counterculture, 1983. Elik Bahima, Colonial and Post-colonial Literature, Migrant Metaphors, British Aligned, A Sense of Place, Essays in Post-colonial Literatures, Peter Thompson, Little Copyright Raja Moderne du Monde Francophone. Chicago, NTC, 1997, Homi Bhabha, The Location of Culture, Routledge 1994, ISBN 0-415-05406-0, Post-colonial Theory and the Arab-Israeli Conflict edited by Philip Carl Salzman and Donna Robinson Devine, Routledge. External links, Contemporary Post-colonial and Post-imperial Literature, Tsar Publications. Critiques of the Post-colonial Discourse by Endeavoring to Assimilate Post-colonialism and its Literary Expressions. Critical Approach, Post-colonial Literary Criticism re-examines colonial literature, especially concentrating upon the social discourse, between the colonizer and the colonized, that shaped and produced the literature. In Orientalism, Edward Sordi analyzed the fiction of Honoré copyright de Balzac, Charles Baudelaire, and L'Autre copyright Armand, and explored how they were influenced, and how they helped to shape the societal fantasy of European racial superiority. Post-colonial fiction writers deal with the traditional independence of formerly subjugated colonial peoples. It also covers literary critiques of and about post-colonial literature, the undertones of which carry, communicate, and justify racialism and colonialism. But most contemporary forms of post-colonial literature present literary and intellectual critique. Post-colonial literature is the body of literary writings that respond to the intellectual discourses of European colonization in Asia, Africa, Middle East, the Pacific and elsewhere. Post-colonial literature addresses the problems and consequences of the decolonization of a country and of a nation, especially the political and cultural traditional colonial discourse, either by modifying or by subverting it, or both. An exemplar post-colonial novel is White Sargasso Sea, by Jean Rhys, a predecessor story to Jane Eyre, by Charlotte Brontë, a literary variety wherein a familiar story is retold from the perspective of a subaltern